Chapter 457, The Mass Teleportation Incident. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. That statement, or quote, could not have been truer for the adventurers who marched forward, unaware of their fate. The man who led them, Guildmaster Richard, stood at the forefront of the entire group, with the rest of the heroic rank adventurers a step or two behind him. Everyone else carefully moved in accordance to the ones who led them like sheep, lambs to the slaughter. Their measured movements meant nothing. The moment the Guildmaster placed one of his legs on the stairs, making the first attempt to ascend, everything changed. Booyasha! That single step forward caused a torrent of energy to instantly engulf the room, and a massive magic circle, unlike anything the world had ever seen before, instantly shone from below the unsuspecting adventurers. All of this happened in a mere instant that no one had any chance to react. Before their bodies could fully comprehend the surge of energy, or their eyes fully capture the intricate patterns of the giant magic circle, it was too late. Shi-ying-ig. The bright purple light that glowed from the complicated lines and drawings in the formulae burned bright, drowning everything within the room in its power. Just from that single step, every single soul in the area was affected, and their bodies all vanished at once. Their journeys, to whatever destination that the light took them, was all started by the Guildmaster's step. And, in a twisted way to keep the poetic statement true, the old man has also vanished as well. Everyone was gone. Well, almost everyone. For amidst the remnant mist from the incredible energy that just burst forth, there were two who stood beside each other completely unaffected by the displacement. One had a black hat, with his suitcase in hand, while the other wore a white hooded cloak with blue and gold designs strapped around her adventurer outfit. Yes, the only ones left in the vast room standing right in front of the stairs were Jet and Lux. Or rather, Ray and Esm. What just happened? Esm's confused voice echoed in the air as she looked around her in shock. 1 second, she was looking at the stairs, surrounded by people in all directions, and now she was all alone with Ray. The Guildmaster was gone. The heroic rank adventurers were gone. Everyone was gone. Why? There was a forced mass teleportation. I could only briefly experience it all, so it makes sense that you don't understand. From the way Ray was speaking, it was clear that he was bothered. No, more than that, he was worried. Forced teleportation? Everyone was taken away? To where? I don't know. Ray slightly yelled, a lot of suppressed frustration bursting out through his voice. It startled Esm for a moment, and he realized that almost instantly. Sorry. No, it's fine. I just want to understand what happened. To Esm, she indeed felt a surge of energy around her, and it seemed like a flash of light flashed before her eyes, but that was pretty much it. The sensation didn't properly register in her brain since it was too fast to capture. Her level and stats were pretty much on the high end compared to other adventurers, so she found it a little worrisome that even she could only see so much. No one could have reacted to a flash that fast. No one but Ray. We would have been transported as well, but thankfully, I activated my and it worked just in time. Ray sighed. You were the closest to me, and the only one I could cover in such a short period of time, so I did that. Despite being the only one to act, and the fact that he was able to save her, Ray didn't look very satisfied. If I wasn't so flustered, I would have first of all activated my buff skills and given myself increased perception of everything. With he could have been more than fast enough both physically and mentally to save everyone. Not only did he get the skill by combining all of Snow's skills into one, he also fused all of Fernand's skills, particularly regarding the ones that improved his perception and speed. All of those, combined with Ray's incredible stats, would have made him capable of acting a lot faster. I was just too slow in my judgment. It all happened so fast that I instinctively reached for. I see. Esm's voice was a little low, and she didn't know what to say to Ray at the moment. She could tell why he would be frustrated. His friends were among the ones who were teleported away, including the girl he has feelings for. None of them were sure where they went to, but Esm could make a pretty good guess. They've probably been scattered around the dungeon. This wasn't particularly the first time a dungeon trap was seen transporting people to separate locations within the same space. Nothing of this scale had ever happened before, but based on precedent, it was sensible to assume that they were taken to another part of the dungeon. I'm sure Ray recognizes this as well. Chances of his friends and his special someone being harmed by the teleportation were low. However, it was a different situation when considering the aftermath. Everyone was randomly transported to various parts of the dungeon. But where? What if they were taken to the most difficult areas, and worst of all, they were isolated? Would even a strong individual be able to survive? What if that happens to Alicia? Esm realized that Ray must have been having these thoughts, and they had to be driving him crazy. That was why she couldn't help but be silent for a while. This mass teleportation. Ray finally spoke up, looking at Esm with eyes reminiscent of someone boiling with pure rage. There was no semblance of kindness or concern on his face, and only vestiges of anxiety could be seen there. There was only the display of wrath. I think Adrian is behind it. Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading. Chapter 458, The Mass Teleportation Incident. Ray was pissed. No, that felt like an understatement compared to what he was feeling at the moment. His friends and allies were all gone, and he couldn't do anything to save them. All his classmates were also caught up in it. Alicia too. Damn it. The rage swelling from within him felt like it could explode him from within. He hated how he was feeling. He knew he was being extremely insensitive to Esm, who was most definitely still confused about the whole thing. But he couldn't stop mulling over everything. What was that, though? A dungeon trap? Ray wondered to himself. If that was the case, then it made a lot of sense. This would be the first time something of this scale had happened, since such traps usually only transported one person or a small group, but that didn't discount the possibility of a much bigger trap. This was a Grand Calamity class dungeon, so something of this scale had to be expected. Yet, Ray wasn't satisfied with that explanation. If it was a trap, then that meant there was no rhyme and reason to its effects. The dungeon just reacted to their presence and used one of its defense mechanisms. Plain and simple. But it can't be that simple. Ray found something gnawing at his heart. He was tempted to leave things as they were, instead focusing on saving everyone, but he couldn't ignore an explanation that was rising from within his depths. Adrian. Maybe he. No, not maybe. He has to be the one behind this. Everything that had happened thus far couldn't have just been coincidences. Ray had tried his best to consider how they could all be natural, but this was the last straw. Perhaps he was seeking out patterns where there were none. Maybe he just felt so frustrated that he needed some living entity to vent on, rather than the automated dungeon defenses. It was even possible that he was being illogical and unreasonable. But this mass teleportation. I think Adrian is behind it. Ray didn't care any longer. He already knew Adrian was behind this, one way or the other, so something of the scale could also be attributed to him. What do you mean, Adrian? Despite faintly hearing Esm's question, he was too immersed in his thoughts to offer a coherent response. But why? What could he gain from doing this? Ray gnashed his teeth as he considered the possibilities. Is this just one of his games? How will this benefit anyone? How will it help the cause? No, perhaps this was never about benefiting humanity. This was merely just Adrian selfishly doing what was going to be beneficial to just him. Even if thousands die in the process. There were no floors here. Just rooms that Ray considered zones. If Alicia, or anyone I care about, gets trapped in a zone that is a lot more dangerous than they can handle. Maybe a boss room or something, then. His heart thumped loudly as his eyes turned bloodshot. With his fists clenched, the air around him began to quiver. Everything shook tremendously. I'll kill him. At this point, his gaze happened to reach Esm, whose face seemed to be pale with hints of fear and disbelief. Her body was vibrating, almost as if it was being shaken by an invisible force. Huh? What? At that moment, Ray snapped out of his dark thoughts and stopped the intense bloodlust that was being released from him without his knowledge or control. Once he did so, Esm gasped very loudly, almost as if she had been deprived of air for so long. She collapsed to the ground and fell on her knees, gasping even more. Ray saw this, and his raging heart instantly melted. I am sorry, Esm. He swiftly apologized, rushing close to her until he knelt. Before he could reach her, she raised a hand and stopped him. I am fine. Don't worry. She slowly raised her head, and streams of tears were falling from her eyes. That went on to break Ray's heart. I'm so sorry. I know you are. But. She placed her two hands on his shoulder, gasping for more air while panting very loudly. Don't you ever do that again. Her gaze seemed dangerous, almost like she was warning him. Ray had never seen Esm so mad at him before, but it seemed like she genuinely was upset for his action, something that he completely understood. Do you understand? Ray slowly nodded his head, causing her to sigh very loudly. Esm raised herself up, though staggering a little once she stood. Her pale face had recovered, and she wiped the tears on her face away. My philosophy makes me consider anyone who may hurt me an enemy. You're dangerous, Ray, and I already knew that. She looked at him as he picked himself up from the ground. But I never considered you a threat to me. That's why I don't see you as an enemy. Esm's moist eyes that glistened with clear blue felt like diamonds carved from the sky. It felt exquisite, yet distant. I don't want that to change, Ray. I don't want to think of you as an enemy, or someone who could hurt me. I'm not an enemy, don't worry. And I won't hurt you. Ray instantly recognized how false his words seemed in light of his recent actions. Yes, he didn't know what he was doing. However, if there was a chance that an unconscious action of his could hurt her, didn't that make him dangerous? That's why I said don't do it again. She said with a small sigh. I know you didn't mean that. Why yet? Thanks. Ray's head shamefully hung on his shoulders as more worrisome thoughts burdened him, almost to the point of being overwhelmed. Then, he felt a warm hand rest on his shoulder. There's no need to overcomplicate things with useless thoughts. Whether or not Adrian is behind this, the most important thing right now is saving everyone. Ray raised his head and saw Esm's smile. That look she gave him, devoid of fear and full of hope. It saved him. So are you coming with me or not? Esme stretched out her hand and nodded invitingly at him. There was no way Ray could refuse now. Yeah. Let's go. Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading. Chapter 459, The Mass Teleportation Incident. Bwooyush. Adonis found himself standing in a vast, dark room. Just a moment earlier, he was standing among the upper echelon of adventurers, only for an overwhelming amount of energy to surge forth and a magic circle appear. He had seen the magic circle clearly, and at that moment nothing but sheer surprise took over his body. His instincts told him to escape to the farthest of locations, but there was nowhere to run to. He could only stand there, helpless, as he looked to the people who stood beside him. The only people capable of making any movements besides him, Jet and Lux. Sure enough, there was movement from their end from Jet, at the very least. He could see a surge of energy emanating from him, the spatial kind. The air around him warped, and the intense energy that filled his and Lux's surroundings seemed too unreal for mere humans to achieve. I'm sure that was at least an S-tier skill. Adonis furrowed his brows. Unfortunately, he couldn't read any of the finer details, or even act in any capacity, before he got transported to the dark room where he currently occupied. Damn it. I was too careless. Clenching his fist, Adonis felt rage swirling from his insides. To think those dragon spies would use such a large-scale spatial magic. I never imagined such a scenario. Jet and Lux had behaved well for the most part, even assisting the conquest tremendously. Their acting was so convincing that he would have bought it if he wasn't so sure about the events of the future. But, they did enough to let his guard down. I wasn't expecting that they would make their move so soon. Gritting his teeth, Adonis admitted that to himself. It was his mistake. There was a chance that this was a mere dungeon trap, since that wasn't unheard of, though nothing of the scale, but after seeing the evidence of spatial magic around Jet and Lux, there was no way he could consider any other explanation. Even if he didn't catch them in the act, they would have still been his primary suspects. After all, this never happened in the previous timeline. There was no mass teleportation reported by the survivors. This was a new development, another alteration to the timeline. And what else is a new development? The participation of those two in the conquest. These elements gave his conclusion perfect coherence, with everything tying itself up in a catastrophic string of logic. Yeah. There's no doubt on my mind. His frown deepened as he stepped forward. It had to have been them. To what end, though? What do they hope to achieve? Adonis felt foolish for even thinking to ask himself that question. They were clearly planning on exterminating everyone, including him, in this dungeon. Violence and destruction are the two basest characteristics of dragons. Adonis spat in rage and disgust. Rising above those feelings, however, was concern specifically towards his comrades. Of course, he was worried about everyone else, but when considering the grand scheme of things, his classmates were the most important. Not only were they the closest to him, but they were the biggest threats to the dragons, and humanity's only hope in its fight against them. It wasn't just him, but the world, that needed them to be safe. Right now I have two missions. His eyes glowed golden and his energy began to spark all over his body. First, save as many people as I can, especially my classmates. Adonis unsheathed the blade strapped around his waist and coated it in condensed light. Second, I'll eliminate those two. Adonis could no longer risk it and wait. Jet and Lux were both immense threats to humanity, as well as immediate threats to the adventurers and his friends. For the sake of everyone, he had to kill the both of them. And fast. Swoosh. Richard swiftly moved, much faster than most youths could even dream of imitating, as he slashed through a horde of undead monsters, greater zombies who swarmed around him. The hell? The world around him was dimly lit thanks to the small fiery lamps that were hung on the four corners of the relatively vast room. It wasn't nearly as large as the ground floor, but the place was still absurdly huge, with old stones making up the floor, walls, and ceiling just as in the ground floor. Richard had no idea how he appeared here, but the moment he did so, he was bombarded with the joint assault of the greater zombies that lurked in the room. His instincts told him to fight. Even if he couldn't comprehend what was happening, as long as he didn't want to die, he had to keep fighting. As he swung his blade and allowed invisible slashes spread around the area, causing incredible damage to his targets, he couldn't help but grit his teeth and wince. With heavy breaths, he jumped from the crowd and used his only magic skill, to sink the ground beneath him so that the zombies would get stuck there. Fortunately for him, while being B-tier monsters, had no active skills. They just had incredible vitality and troublesome regenerative capabilities. Their strength was also nothing to discount. Thankfully, though, his attack was successful, and just as one would sink into wet cement, the dozens of greater zombies fell right in. Whoosh! Twisting in the air, he found a way to avoid the sinking ground and landed just a few meters away from the only exit door in sight. I should escape now. There's no point facing so many of them at once. It was better to leave the room and hopefully regroup with another, or multiple adventurers, hopefully heroic rank ones. I was probably forcefully transported here. Those stairs. It has to be a dungeon trap. The guild master sighed, almost mortified that he had been so careless. I didn't even sense anything or notice it. His thoughts trailed as he approached the exit and pushed his hand towards the door. I just found myself As soon as Richard touched the door, his body froze and the entirety of his mind trembled. This. His eyes bulged as tears of blood proceeded out of them. What is this? Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading. Chapter 460, The Mass Teleportation Incident. The mass teleportation incident transported an approximate number of 9,700 adventurers to multiple zones within the Grand Calamity class dungeon. Within this massive structure, there were hundreds of zones, nearly 1,000 of them. Counting the corridors and other areas that would not qualify as a zone, there were probably a few thousand potential locations for the victims to appear. Accounting for the number of victims, which was much higher than the available locations, it was inevitable that some people would end up getting transported to the same location. This selection, as was the case with the entire mass teleportation, was totally random. That meant party members were split up from one another, and solo adventurers were forced to be among people whom they would normally not interact with. Weak adventurers were mixed in with strong ones. Strong adventurers were stuck with incompetent buffoons. To make matters worse, each zone was a different area based on the random difficulty of the dungeon, so weaker adventurers could be summoned to extremely dangerous zones, while powerful ones could end up in the most uneventful place. This randomness. It was fatal for the conquest. Merely a few hours after the mass teleportation incident occurred, nearly 2,000 adventurers had already died. Based on that number, and the progressive difficulty of survival in such a horrid place, it was only a matter of time before everyone was wiped out. Everyone. Without exception. We've been lucky so far, thought Jake, as he walked alongside members of his newly formed party. None of them had no choice but to work together if they didn't want to die. Their teamwork still left a lot to be desired, but they had somehow managed to survive this long despite most of them being common rank adventurers. Only Jake and one other were veterans, and that wasn't nearly enough to survive in such a dreary place. As his dark hair sat on his worried face, and his brown eyes flickered, he swallowed hard. He couldn't help but worry that this luck that his party had would soon run out. The air in the dungeon hung heavy with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the distant echoes of the adventurers' footsteps. Jake and his party walked through the narrow corridors, their armor clinking softly with each step. The torchlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the cold, damp walls. As they turned a corner, the torchlight revealed a chamber bathed in an otherworldly glow. A congregation of skeletal figures emerged from the shadows, adorned in tattered robes and brandishing ancient staffs. Monsters! His eyes bulged. And these weren't mere monsters too. Undead mages, their hollow eye sockets glowing with an ethereal light, began chanting in unison. And no. The atmosphere thickened with an intense energy that sent shivers down Jake's spine. The adventurers drew their weapons, a mixture of anticipation and fear etched on their faces. The leader, a seasoned warrior named Sir Roland, barked orders to the party. They're just caster skeletons, and not too many of them. Attack quickly before they're done. Casters had less defensive capabilities, so even if they were C-tier monsters, even a common adventurer could beat one, if he acted quickly. Added to the fact that they had all leveled up a few times already, they were a lot stronger than before. They could have already surpassed the previous assessment given to them by the guild. And so, with all of this in mind, the clash between the living and the undead commenced. Jake, a skilled rogue with agile movements and a keen eye, darted between the swirling signs of spells and skeletal casters. Whoosh! His dual daggers glinted in the dim light as he struck with precision, dispatching the weaker undead with swift, calculated moves. Everyone followed suit and dispatched the casters before they could finish their spells. All seemed well. But Jake couldn't shake off the negative feelings within him. That feeling of dread that told him that all was not well. Perhaps it was his instincts, or just paranoia. The dungeon proved it to be the former. Whoosh! Just as the party was about to advance, the true threat emerged from the back of the chamber, a towering figure in a tattered cloak, a lich. Jake's eyes, just as with everyone else, widened beyond what should be considered normal. A lich. It had just emerged from the darkness on the ground, and even now the black energy swirling around him overwhelmed the room. A lich, just like a death knight, was an A-tier undead, the epitome of necromancy. ZZZTTTZZZZ. The lich's skeletal fingers twitched, and arcane energy crackled in the air. A wave of dark magic surged through the room, freezing the adventurers in their tracks. There was no need to cast a spell, or to wait for delayed activation. The effects were instant. And they were brutal. GGUH. Sir Roland's eyes widened as he fought against the invisible force, but it was futile. The undying magic gripped the party, rendering them immobile. More undead mages closed in, seemingly out of nowhere, casting spells that sapped the life force from the adventurers. Desperation gripped Jake as he sliced through the skeletal horde, but the relentless assault continued. Sir Roland, his once proud armor now tarnished and weakened, fell to his knees as the lich's malevolent laughter echoed through the chamber. "Hien Dadao and Wu," the lich hissed, its voice resonating with the weight of darkness. No one understood a single word it said, not that they could, even if they wanted to. Jake surveyed the battlefield and found out the truth. His companions lay motionless, drained of life. All of them, without exception, were dead. Eek. Just as he had suspected, their luck had run out. Fear clawed at him. You. But why? He was beginning to regret his decision to continue with the conquest despite his instincts telling him otherwise. I should have gone. I should have left when I had the chance. Just how many people had these very thoughts in their last moments? How many felt the regret and pain that Jake felt now? Probably all of the adventurers who died after the mass teleportation. Even Jake's allies, before their inevitable demise, must have also felt it. The raw, overwhelming feeling of regret. Yet, despite these rabid emotions and rabid sensations, a fire burned within. He had to survive, if only to carry the memory of his fallen comrades. Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading. Sorry for the random character insert. Haha. Chapter 461, The Mass Teleportation Incident. Rah. With a burst of agility, Jake lunged towards the lich. Whoosh. His daggers gleamed as he struck at the ancient creature, but the lich effortlessly parried each blow with its bony hands. And no. His widened eyes leaked out tears. What exactly was he expecting? That he could win against the likes of an A-tier monster? No. That was impossible. The undead mages closed in, surrounding Jake with an impenetrable wall of death. Yet, despite it being so far out of reach, why didn't he want to give up? Was this because of his desire to live so badly? Or was it the pride he had as an adventurer, as a human who craved freedom? Channeling his rogue skill, Jake vanished into the shadows, evading the grasping hands of the undead. He reappeared behind the lich, aiming for a swift strike to its spine. The daggers pierced through its ethereal cloak, but the lich merely chuckled. Loyoin Evndi, it sneered, turning to face Jake. Undead mages unleashed a barrage of spells, forcing Jake to dance through the chaos. He dodged and rolled, narrowly avoiding the deadly magic that crackled in the air. Jake didn't know how he was still moving, despite all the odds. As a rogue, he was indeed the fastest of his comrades, but there was no way the lich didn't have any means to capture him. There was a chance that he was simply being toyed with by the monster, but Jake didn't care. Exhaustion clawed at him, but the rogue pressed on. In a final desperate gambit, Jake channeled his remaining strength into a flurry of attacks. Urea! The lich's defenses seemed to waver, but that was only an illusion that Jake desperately wanted to see. In that moment, he already knew he had lost. Bwuum. The undead mages closed in, casting a binding spell that snaked around Jake like ethereal chains. He fought against the magical restraints, his muscles straining with the effort. It's no use. His blurry vision looked around and saw just how outnumbered he was. This truly was the end. The lich raised its staff, preparing a devastating finishing blow. Jake's heart raced, knowing he stood at the precipice of oblivion. As the dark magic surged towards him, the rogue closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable end. Then. Chaos Blade. Strike. In that moment, a deafening resounded in Jake's ears as the destruction of several bones instantly filled the air. Almost as soon as the voice roared, a powerful wind blew and instantly sent every other bony construct around Jake into the realm of destruction. All of it happened in the span of a few seconds. By the time Jake opened his eyes, the monsters were no more. Only one man and a woman stood in front of him, as well as a bunch of other adventurers behind them. He recognized the two who wouldn't. There were the rising stars of the adventurers CityJet and Lux. Found another one. Looks like I was a bit too late for the others, though. Ray looked around the room and saw the corpses of about 5 people. They looked barely humans, as their skin seemed to have somehow fused with their bone and become darkened with decay. They were mere husks of their former selves, and if left alone, they were doomed to become undead. Ray turned back and looked at the couple hundred adventurers that stood at a safe distance and watched him. Anyone with fire magic, please use it on these corpses. Ray didn't need to explain any further, as adventurers already knew what he implied. A few adventurers stepped forward for the role, so he looked away and focused on the adventurer he had just saved. He looks just a bit over 20. If I had just been a little late, he would have died. Just like that. This wouldn't be the first time he had saved people in this dungeon when they were on the brink of death. It had happened several times already. Ever since the mass teleportation incident, he and Esm had been traveling from one zone to another, trying to find and save as many people as possible. Of course, they had to save a lot of them at several instances, so there was also that. The problem is that I've not found any of my friends, and the people I save end up sticking to me. Even now, as he looked at Jake learning his name and details thanks to he could barely contain his disappointment that it wasn't his friends he encountered. Till now, he hadn't found Alicia, Adonis, Noah. Anyone of interest to him. Just these weaklings that keep clinging onto me like parasites. Ray knew his thoughts were unkind, but he couldn't help it. The adventurers were slow, weak, and overly frightened. Their fragility and overdependence on him was truly infuriating, but he had to endure. To make the work faster, I already sent my other duplicates to other zones to look for everyone. He made sure his clones were disguised as random strong looking adventurers, so there would be no connection made to him. The plan was to make them seek out survivors, bring those survivors to him, and then they would go and seek out even more survivors. That way, the search would go on faster. It's been nearly a day since we got separated, and I can already see the exhaustion on these people's faces. Ray knew he would have to set up camp soon, and the thought of that annoyed him even further. Endure, Ray. Endure. He returned to his jet persona and knelt before the pathetic looking adventurer before him. Jake was still shivering, obviously not recovered from the trauma he had just faced. Ray's eyes glowed brightly as he used to make all of that go. Are you all right? Can you stand? He asked, stretching his hand while planting a calm smile on his face. Why yes. Jake looked surprised that he could move properly. He soon rose to his feet, bowing several times as thanks to Ray or rather, Jet. As one would expect, he waved it off and smiled at the man. I'm just glad you're fine. Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading. Seems like Ray is slowly losing it. That hold he has. It's slowly beginning to loosen. Me likey. Chapter 462, Stranded. You. Noah Sherlock stood at the forefront of his previously small, now large, group. His grip was tight on the hilt of his katana, the night blade. Around him, the air crackled with tension as the group navigated through the labyrinthine corridors of the Grand Calamity-class dungeon. The mass teleportation incident had scattered them, separating friends and allies in a chaotic jumble of fate. With each step, Noah could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down upon him. As a heroic rank adventurer, it was his duty to lead his group through the perils of the dungeon and ensure their survival. But the odds were stacked against them, with weaker adventurers mixed in among their ranks and the ever-present threat of powerful undead monsters lurking in the shadows. With the constant threats everywhere, we've hardly slept. Everyone is exhausted. Even though the rest still managed to get some shut-eye, he could not. He had to protect the 100 or so adventurers with him, no matter the cost. The only good news about all of this was that he managed to level up a lot. Still, with the constant stress weighing him down, he felt weaker rather than stronger. Noah glanced over his shoulder at the exhausted faces of his companions. Their strength and morale were pretty much worn thin by constant battles and relentless danger. But there was no time for rest or respite, not when the survival of every member of their group hung in the balance. I'm probably the youngest here, yet. Drawing upon his skills and 3 weeks' experience, Noah steeled himself for the challenges that lay ahead. With a silent command, he activated one of his enchanted items, allowing him to move with supernatural speed and agility. Whoosh! Shadows danced around him as he led the charge, his blade flashing in the dim light of the dungeon. After scouting ahead and returning, he led his group forward. Their journey brought them to a vast chamber, its walls adorned with ancient runes and symbols of mysterious power. But, this zone they found themselves in was no sanctuary. The air reeked of decay, and the ground was littered with bones of fallen comrades. Even with the forbidden beauty all around, it was still a house of death. As, other than the dead bodies on the ground, lurking in the shadows were the undead horrors that would haunt anyone's nightmares. Zombies. Lots and lots of them. Most of them were the average kind, but Noah could spot a couple of greater zombies in the mix. Looks like another round of battle. He sighed. Noah's hand tightened around the hilt of his katana, its gleaming edge held the promise of salvation for those who followed him. His cloak billowed as he stepped forward, a lone figure determined to defy the chaos that threatened to consume them all. Listen up. Noah's voice cut through the grim atmosphere. We're in this together. No matter who you were before, we're a team now. Stick close, follow my lead, and we might just survive this hell. The weary adventurers nodded, drawing what strength they had left. Noah could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty of their fate etched on their faces. At the very least, discounting the ones I can handle by myself, our numbers are superior. If 3 or 4 charge at one each, we should be fine. He prepared his tired muscles and made sure to memorize the positions of the B-tier monsters in the crowd. After only a few seconds of doing so, he was ready. Leave the greater zombies to me. Then, with a wordless battle cry, Noah charged into the fray, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. The Nightblade hummed with power as he unleashed a flurry of strikes, each one imbued with the elemental attributes of his enchanted items. Fire and lightning danced along the blade, granting greater damage to the enemies. But even as Noah fought with all his skill and strength, he could feel the tide of battle turning against them. The undead were relentless, despite their numbers being considerably smaller. The adventurers were still having trouble dealing with them, even with their advantage. For real. He sighed to himself. Guess I have no choice now. Noah surged to life, tendrils of darkness coalescing around him as he summoned constructs from the depths of his own shadow. With a flick of his wrist, Noah sent the constructs hurtling towards the troublesome horde. The shadows twisted and contorted, taking the form of spectral warriors that clashed with the undead in a whirlwind of steel and darkness. The greater zombies stumbled under the onslaught, their decayed flesh no match for the ethereal blades that cut through them like butter. Damn, my mana. He winced, slightly feeling lightheaded as a result. Noah already knew that mere shadows would not be enough to completely stop the tide of undead that threatened to overwhelm everyone, but with that move, his allies could take on the rest. Now, to focus on my own task. His eyes narrowed on the enemies he had to face. With a swift motion, he hurled his knight blade into the fray, the enchanted blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. Whoosh! The blade found its mark, cleaving through the ranks of the undead with a satisfying thud. As the knight blade returned to his outstretched hand, Noah unleashed a barrage of slashes and thrusts, his movements a blur of speed and precision. The greater zombies fell like wheat before the scythe, their rotting corpses no match for the skill of the heroic rank adventurer. But the battle was far from over. The undead horde suddenly seemed to increase, and Noah could already guess how. The corpses. They've become undead. With a much greater number than before, the zombies seemed to be even more threatening. But, he couldn't stop. Bwoosh! Noah's heart raced as he fought on, his blade dancing with the fury of a man possessed. Swish! The shadows twisted and writhed around him, their dark tendrils snaring the undead and dragging them into the abyss. William. With each swing of his blade, Noah felt the weight of the enemies pressing down on him. But he refused to yield, refused to succumb to the despair that threatened to engulf him. I'm reaching my limit. He never imagined going down in the dungeon. Even now, the idea of dying wasn't something he readily embraced. But somehow, Noah felt good. He felt happy, being able to fight and defeat so many enemies while everyone had no choice but to rely on him. This version of himself. It was close, a lot closer, to the ideal he sought after. And so, he didn't bother worrying about dying, or fearing for what would become of his life if he made a single misstep. Noah just kept swinging his blade, living in the bliss of the moment. Ha! Ha! As the last of the greater zombies fell, Noah stood amidst the carnage, his breath ragged and his muscles aching. But there was no time to rest, no time to savor his victory. For danger still lurked in the shadows, waiting to consume him, and everyone else, once more. With a weary sigh, Noah tightened his grip on the knight blade and pressed forward. Once again, just like before, he was able to win. Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading. Still like Noah's development, I won't lie. Let's hope nothing bad happens to him. Chapter 463, Stranded. A week had passed since the start of the Grand Conquest, and almost the same amount of time had passed since the mass teleportation incident. So much had happened since then, and Ray, sighing as heavily as he possibly could, didn't want to start thinking about it. Unfortunately, he didn't have any choice in the matter. Let us begin our emergency meeting, he said, looking around him to observe the faces of the competent adventurers he had in his camp. About 6 master rank adventurers, Asm, and Noah Sherlock, who they just met the previous day, were the people present for the meeting. Everyone else was asleep, and rightfully so. It was clear that exhaustion had reached the maximum limit. Unfortunately, that wasn't even the peak of the problem. After spending a week, scouring this entire place even with the aid of my duplicates and yet not making any progress locating the boss room or the entrance, I no longer have my doubts. Ray's thoughts trailed as he gazed emptily into space. The position of zones in this entire dungeon is changing. The rest had noticed it too, though a lot later than him. For one, they ended up encountering the same corridors or zones a couple of times despite already passing and marking them. Also, even with the dungeon being so massive, it couldn't have an infinite amount of space and zones. Yet, it seemed impossible to make any real progress. They were trapped, in every sense of the word, and there didn't seem to be any way out. Even if they're not at prime power, My duplicates have used to try to find the exit, but they never find it. Ray felt his heart tighten. He even tried using teleportation, attempting to return to the ground floor, but his spatial magic identified a particular place he had been based on its location. And so, anytime he tried to teleport there, he just ended up in a random zone. That was irrefutable proof that space was shifting, and constantly. Other than Noah's party, we've not encountered any group in days. It's safe to say that we're not far away from the rest, since the zones keep changing. That left just two options. Either the others were dead, or they were also in an organized group, trying to navigate their way through the dungeon. It was obvious which option sounded the most appealing. Adonis should have rallied everyone on his end, so maybe they're with him. Ray had good reason to believe this. But sometimes a gnawing feeling would tell him that he was just engaging in wishful thinking. Even if the others are still a bit inadequate, Adonis is strong and fast enough to handle the undead in this dungeon. I should give credit to the rest as well. The fact that he hadn't encountered a single one of his classmates simply meant that they were together. It's a lot harder for two groups to meet up among over 1,000 shifting locations than it is for multiple ones. That was Ray's theory, and he hoped it was correct. Today was supposed to be the last day of the conquest, which means the dungeon might be gone once the day is over. As Ray began, he stared into the unkempt faces of his allies. Their gaze was lowered, but their expressions were hardened. All of them knew this much. There's a chance we might get stuck here forever if we don't find the exit today. Ray said, though this was a lie. He could easily leave the dungeon by opening a portal to a stable location that he had been to. With this ability, he could even take everyone with him. But what of the rest? As long as he couldn't find Alicia and the rest of his classmates, Ray couldn't simply escape from this place with the people he had now. Though that might become inevitable. The food supply has run short, even with the quota management system we employed. After one last round, there'll be nothing to go around. Another person spoke up. She was one of the master rank adventurers, and the one in charge of food distribution. Thanks for bringing that up, Beverly. I suppose we'll address that too. Ray strained a smile as she nodded back at him. He had more than enough resources within his, so he wasn't really worried about anyone starving. Even if he didn't want to share, he could just send everyone back to the outside world and let them get food themselves. In all likelihood, they really weren't stranded, at least, in Ray's perspective. The real issue is the miasma, and how it's causing weakness among people. They don't know this, but I constantly purify the air so they can have an inflow of mana into their system. Ray rubbed his chin as he looked around him. If it wasn't for this intervention, most of the adventurers would have died already. Ray wasn't expecting some sort of thanks for his deeds. After all, there were ways he could be a lot more benevolent in, which he chose not to be. But, none of those were his concerns. The only problem on my mind right now is how to link up with the rest. That was the one thing Ray couldn't do, the single problem he was yet to solve, and it drove him crazy. He became more and more convinced that Adrian had to be behind this somehow. This is like a puzzle. He wants me to figure out the game, doesn't he? Ray gritted his teeth. But I don't get it. An aura of frustration nearly surged from him, but one glance at Esm caused him to calm himself. If, by the end of today, we make no progress, then I'll just send everyone back outside and do this myself. By everyone, he meant Esm as well. Whatever your plan is, Adrian, I don't care. His eyes burned bright as the picture of the boy in the white mask appeared in his mind. You should have just left me and my friends out of it. Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading. Seems like a lot, right? What do you think is going on? Any theories? Chapter 464, Stranded. The meeting lasted for about an hour. Within that period, all the issues that plagued the adventurers were raised, but most of them could not be resolved. In the end, the only thing that could really be done was finding a way out of the current situation. As a result, the adventurers placed their faith in Jet and Lux as they continued marching towards progress. They traversed various zones from incredibly ancient catacombs, to the more pristine halls of death. They encountered various kinds of undead as well. Specters, ghouls, animated corpses, and several monster corpse variants, all of whom were taken care of by Jet and Lux. Even though they had a third heroic rank adventurer on their side, Sherlock, he had been leading his own group for days without rest before meeting the bigger group. So he spent most of the time resting. Besides, even if Sherlock wasn't exhausted, merely watching how the duo swiftly eliminated the enemies, it was easy to see how he would only hold them back. After spending hours like this, they finally arrived in front of yet another entrance. Everyone held their breath as they watched their leaders draw near to the massive stone door. No one could predict what came next. Ray felt an odd sensation as he stood in front of the colossal double door before him. The dimly lit area around him felt eerie, but Ray ignored everything. He ignored the few thousand people that anxiously stared at his back, murmuring words to one another. He ignored the incredibly large hall that they occupied, and the motionless bodies of the greater zombies that occupied the ground. The entire arena felt like it had experienced an earlier battle, but since Ray saw no corpse, and he still saw undead present, he figured the person either escaped, or the monsters spawned there after a set period of time. He removed his thoughts from them, though. The air felt musty, tense as well. But Ray didn't pay any mind to those details. All of his attention was on the door in front of him and what lay ahead. The miasma density beyond this door is incredible. Just touching this door alone, I can feel so much impurity seeping through. Ray narrowed his eyes, feeling the warm, disgusting sensation on his hand. The only reason why he wasn't experiencing any negative effects was due to his passive skills and incredible stats. Any other person touching the double door was bound to instantly be afflicted with miasma poisoning just from skin contact. It was that intense. Yet, that wasn't all Ray noticed. The pressure inside is so intense that I can't properly utilize my sensory capabilities. It felt like space was so twisted inside. There's no doubt about it. This is the boss room. Ray nearly leaked out a smile, but he suppressed his amusement. At long last, we've finally come this far. He slowly turned back and looked at the adventurers who looked at him with curious stares. They were clearly expecting a verdict from him. It's dangerous up ahead. I believe up ahead is the boss room. Gasps of shock filled the area, and everyone instantly displayed worry. Their weary faces showed fear, but Ray quickly spoke up to assuage them of their worries. I understand your concerns, but we can't miss this opportunity. If we delay for too long, the zone might shift. As soon as he said this, the aversion of the adventurers slowly began to dissipate. We have to go together, or else the zones might shift while some of us are inside, he added. The moment they heard this, they gained their motivation to move forward. In the meeting that was conducted earlier that day, there were only two solutions to the current problem the group faced. One was finding the exit and leaving the dungeon. This was easier said than done, since no one had been able to locate the ground floor since the mass teleportation incident, and many even suspected that it probably didn't exist anymore. Then, there was the second option. Subjugating the dungeon boss. If they killed the boss, there was a chance that this whole nightmare would end. Even if they wouldn't get teleported of the dungeon, they could at least stop the zone shifts. There was no evidence that this would be the case, but people were just desperate to believe something. As such, they clung to that hope. To play my role well and stick to the final bits of the plan, I need an audience. Ray's eyes scoured among the thousands on his side. They were an approximate of 3,200. I suppose they'll suffice for the job. He only had to think of a way to preserve them from the intense miasma beyond the walls of the dungeon, and he already thought of the best explanation. Stick to me, everyone. I will now use the sacred power of my Chaos Blade. It can only be used once in a year, so I haven't been able to use it until now. Ray brought out his special weapon from his briefcase, thrusting his hand into the air as the blade's tip faced the sky. Sanctuary. Everyone marveled in awe, waiting for what would happen. Then. Bwooyum. A bright white light seared through the air, instantly creating a dense membrane that shrouded everything within the vicinity of the wielder. In no time at all, the thousands of people were encased within a widespread field that protected them from the external world. This, according to Jet, was called a hidden effect of his Chaos Blade. It was a lie, though. I just used my skill to protect everyone, but made it seem like it came from the blade. By also giving an excuse about the cooldown period, he would ward off any suspicion about his use of this power. I can also make it seem like a very powerful barrier, so they won't be too scared in the boss room. With a wide smile on his face, Ray opened the door and stepped into the room. They just need to keep their eyes on me. Asterisk. 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 Thanks for reading.